Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this event on predictability and understandability in lethal autonomous weapons. My name is Arthur Holland Michel. I am an associate researcher here at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, where I work on the security and technology program in issues related to artificial intelligence and autonomy. I am delighted to have you all here today to discuss this topic that has come up a lot in the ongoing discourse around lethal autonomous weapons systems. In fact, if you take a survey of the discourse, it's even clear to see that there is generally agreement around the idea that autonomous weapons should always do what we expect them to do, and that they should always do so for reasons that we can understand, that they should be understandable or explainable or intelligible. But that area of consensus or of convergence, if you will, belies some complexities and some subtleties that we believe are very important, that we believe have significant policy implications, and that we have been looking at for quite some time. Indeed, we released a report on a number of these issues last year called The Black Box Unlocked. Our wonderful producer Wenting is posting a link to that report in the chat box now. I recommend you all take a look at it because it delves into a number of these issues, a number of these complexities, if you will. We're also seeing in the ongoing deliberations of the group of government experts on laws that indeed is meeting this week, that issues around predictability and understandability are core to a number of the proposed recommendations, policy ideas that the group is exploring and looking for ways to converge upon. Our hope today is just to bring a little bit more clarity, a little bit more depth, and a little bit more perspective on some of these questions around what it means for an autonomous weapon to be predictable or understandable, why it matters, why we want them to be predictable and understandable, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities in getting them to have those qualities, in making systems that are appropriately predictable and that have a appropriate or a workable level of understandability. For that, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Aude Billard from EPFL, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, a true legend in the world of robotics, human-machine interaction, and machine learning, to have a bit of a discussion that will run us through these issues. Before we jump in, I'm going to just give you a very brief run of show. Aude and I will speak for about 30 minutes about some of these topics, and then we're going to open it up to hear from you. As you will see, there is a Q&A function on this Zoom interface where you can post your questions. I encourage you to post your questions at any point during the discussion, and we're going to block about 20 minutes at the end of this event to explore those questions, to engage with them, and to really answer your most pressing queries. I should also note that this event is being recorded. It will, like all Unidir public events, be posted on our social media channels as well as YouTube. That's all for the administrative side. And so with that, I want to jump right in to my discussion with our esteemed guest, Ord. Ord, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here.
So first, I was wondering if you could, perhaps just to situate our audience a little bit, tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do on autonomous systems and how it may be relevant to some of the issues being discussed in the context of the group of government experts on lethal autonomous weapons.
Yes, and let me start by saying good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody, depending on where you are located. So the work that we do in my laboratory here at the Swiss Institute of Technology in Lausanne is very much in developing AI system dedicated to robotics. So we want robots to become more intelligent, and we want robots to be able to learn. And this is really the core of the work that we're doing. It's to enable robots to use AI to gather more information and to learn from the information that they're getting from the world, be it through cameras or other type of sensors. We have a specificity of the application that we're looking at, which is to work on manipulation. So we have different arms, and we can do different types of manipulation, things that are very related to what you're looking at when you're drafting this type of documents. Is typically to catch objects in flight, which is very similar to catching missiles. We're also having different robots that can throw, which is a little bit similar also to throwing machine that could throw, all type of weapons. Not that we work with the army, not that we've done that in any case, but I'm very familiar with the type of technology that will be required to do this work. We do work also with vehicles, semi-autonomous vehicles, what we call shared control type of vehicles, where you have a human that is still in control. We don't work with cars, but we work with Segway type of vehicles where you can really stand on it, and that also has potential application in the military. Could you hear me well?
Yes, no, thank you. And the sound is coming through very well. It just took me a moment to find the unmute button. So I'd imagine that over the course of your work, especially since it deals so much with the interaction between robots or autonomous systems and humans, that many of the questions around predictability and understandability have surfaced over the course of your career. And so I wanted to jump into that a little bit. When we're talking about autonomous systems, what do we actually mean by the term predictability? And what sort of factors make an autonomous system more or less predictable in any given instance?
So, by the way, predictability and understandability are two concepts that have arisen only very recently in the literature. And these are the weaknesses of the field, I must really admit, because they're not that predictable and they're not that understandable. So that must be clearly stated to start with, especially when it comes to putting some AI and some machine learning in it. Whichever tool you use, whether it's deep learning or any of those, they actually all suffer from similar weaknesses. Now, coming down to predictability, for a long time, when we talk about predictability, we thought that it was deterministic. And so it was more of a battle between, is the system stochastic or probabilistic, or is it deterministic? So, but deterministic, that means that if you give the same input to your system, it should give you the same response. And you will say that at least will be reassuring. It turns out that many of the systems that we have, when you give them the exact same input, you give them the exact same image, let's say of the same, the same representation of the world or the same field view. Given that you know that there is uncertainty into the input that you're receiving, you may generate also a probabilistic response. So if you have a system that has a probabilistic response, then the system is not deterministic, and this adds uncertainty. You could still say that it's predictable because you could say, look, it has a probability of giving 3 possible answers. let's take example. I love to take examples because it allows people also to relate. So I'll take always 2 examples for this entire session. One example will be a drone flying, and it receives an image of the target. Okay, and the image says, okay, here is your target. It's a little window overlaid to the entire image of the camera. And now the drone may have 3 possible actions that it could do. One is to come closer. The other one is to turn back because this is not a target I was looking for. And it could be that it will just continue moving at the same rate. Okay, 3 possible actions. So it's deterministic in the sense that you have 3 actions, but it may pick any of those 3 with some probability. And so in that sense, you can predict that it will be any of those 3, but you don't know which of the 3 will actually be taken because it may, it may depend on slight, simple, different variation onto the control system. But that's just to get us started on this notion of deterministic versus stochastic, which can still be somewhat unpredictable. You could have purely deterministic systems that always give you the same answer. There is no stochasticity. These are preferred usually. But then don't forget that the input itself is usually stochastic. So take again the example of the image that you're receiving. Imagine that you have a drone flying over an area and it samples that at frequency, 24 frames, 24 images a second, but it flies super fast. So you fly it twice through the same area, and depending on when it started, it's going to give you different image. Some of them will be 24 seconds, so every second, and the other one will be every 2 seconds or every 3 seconds or something like that. So you may have a delay between what the drone. Well, you may have a difference between travel the exact same region, but you get a different set of inputs. And if you get a different set of input, you may get a different set of response, even though your system is deterministic. So the stochasticity or the unpredictability of the system comes from the fact that the world is itself a little unpredictable. And this variation enters the system and generates some unpredictability. So added to that, go ahead. Added to that is when you have systems that can learn and improve over time. And then there, if we go back to the stochastic system, for instance, its probability distribution function may change over time. So that also you may not know, or you may know it. So that also adds some uncertainty to the system. You don't know how far it is in its learning period. And so you have difficulty also predicting this.
So just to put that into somewhat concrete, or perhaps more concrete terms than the excellent example that you gave, I'm sure a lot of our audience members have read articles, for example, that said that this particular artificial intelligence was able to recognize this particular target with 99% accuracy, which might to some mean that, okay, 99 out of 100 times, it's going to identify that target the right way, which to me and to many, one might imagine sounds like it's very predictable. But you're saying that may not necessarily translate into full predictability in the field. So,
I mean, there are different aspects to that. Usually it's fairly reassuring indeed when you have this type of performance. The question you may want to ask is, how did you test the performance? What was the data set that you used to test the performance? And as you all know, that the data set is never going to be inclusive of everything that your drone is ever going to see. And if we take a different example, we imagine that we have a char. I think you say that in English, right? A char is moving around and has also to find targets or vehicles and could potentially fire on those targets. It goes on the desert, and depending on how it moves on the desert, if the desert is flat space, then yeah, probably you have a similar view across different deserts. But if it's a little hilly, depending on how you travel it, you're going to have different angle of view. And so this goes back to, how did you test the capability of your system? Did you have really a wide range, so wide range of images that can cover all possible images that a drone or one of those vehicles will ever encounter in the field? Nobody will claim that this is possible. It's impossible, not to mention that often, you have things inside these fields. you may have other vehicles or other drones that are flying at different areas, so in different speed and things like that. These are obstacles that will partially occlude the target. So we are never completely certain that what we've tested is representative of the reality, but it's close enough. So often if you have about 99%, it means that in practice, you're probably close to 80% or 85, something like that. It depends. It really very much depends on that. The major concern also, and just like to point this out, people often care about the percentage of classification performance on the target. So you want a target to be well detected, but you also want the non-target to not be mistaken for a target. And it's actually very rare that you have a system which is 99.8% performant on classifying correctly the target, and similarly close to 100% performance to not classify anything else as a target. In fact, it's a balance. As you come closer to perfection, to recognizing target, you start seeing targets where there are none. And you may want to pay attention to this. These are called the false positive. You incorrectly assign a positive saying this is the target to things that were not the target.
And if I may, I think it is an enormous public good for you to bring this up. If there is one thing that everybody should perhaps learn from statistics, it is the concepts of false positives, false negatives, precision, and recall. So if you do have any of you who are listening 5 minutes while you're drinking a coffee this afternoon to Google precision and recall, I would highly encourage you to do so. Well, with that all being said, I mean, it sounds a little bit odd, like the idea that a complex autonomous system such as a lethal autonomous weapon could ever be fully or perfectly predictable is kind of impossible. That there will always be some degree of unpredictability. Do you think that's a fair statement?
In the field, yes. In a context that you know well, that you control well, where it acts always in the same. So take a rifle that you've attached to the border of the entry of a country. I know that at some point some countries were interested in that. That always look at the exact same landscape, and it sees this this landscape by day, by night, summer, winter, and you gather all of this, and this is your entire training set, and you make sure that you have a lot of things passing by that landscape. Then you come close to really being able to say that you have a complete data set of everything that this machine could see, and you have possibly close to full predictability. So when you're in a sort of a static environment, fairly well known, fairly well described, yes. If you have something flying around or moving around, really in the field with lots of things happening, no, I think it's not realistic.
One of the interesting things that we landed on in the report is that some level of unpredictability is a feature of full autonomy. Because as the type of weapon you described there is not particularly autonomous. It's not able to move around or search for targets or make complex decisions. And so one perhaps simplistic, but I think valuable way to think about it is as autonomy increases, there is some degree of unpredictability embedded in that. But I wanted to move us along because I think you've brought us to a really valuable understanding of predictability and unpredictability here. But as you said, there are moments where even a system that has potentially very high performance could fail. And it has been recognized within the GGE, the group of government experts, that one potentially very important risk mitigation measure is for whichever human is overseeing an autonomous weapon to understand that weapon so that they can identify when it is making one of these potentially very serious mistakes, for example, falsely identifying a false positive. So seeing a target that is actually a civilian. So that gets to my next question, which is to ask you, what is actually meant by understandability, or as it's also sometimes referred to in the literature, explainability and interpretability in the context of autonomous weapons? And are there different types of quote unquote understanding that humans interacting with those systems can have?
Okay, yeah, so it's a lot of questions in one. Maybe I'll separate the understandability or interpretability into two different parts. And as I understand it also from your document, there is one part, which is when the soldier has to take a decision, or whomever is supposed to take a decision to press on a button and say, yes, go and fire now, because you've provided me with, or you know, I press the button, yes, go fly to that target and drop the bomb. Whatever is the decision being taken, what you want is that the system ahead of time is providing you with information that is interpretable and is sufficiently well documented. So if we take again the simple example of you know, the image provided by this drone, you have a drone going around searching for targets, and you have all these maybe swarm of drones giving you all these different targets, and they give you little blocks of images, of sub-images, where they say, I think it's a target, maybe it's a target, and they give you a probability score with this. And then the person needs to be able to be, you know, well trained to understand what this means. You know, if the window is large, this often also relates to the unpredictability. Actually, the wider the window, often, you know, the less sure the system is about where it is exactly in that window. You know, it could be slightly on the left, slightly on the right, but anything, it could be anywhere within this window, which, by the way, is very important, because when you press on the button and says to another drone to go and fire on the target, you need to say where. Would it be slightly on the left, slightly on the right, slightly at the bottom? So the person who's going to get the information from, let's say, the vision system or the drone, and will be able to also control and provide inputs to the other autonomous weapon that will fly there, needs to understand both the commands that it can send, the precision at which the machine is working. When you say, you know, go to the target within 5-degree precision, what does that mean exactly? How does that relate to the precision in which? So there is the interpretability of the input and the output that you're giving. There is another aspect, which is when everything fails, when you know, the thing went and dropped the bomb on a village, and now you want to understand what went wrong. This is a completely different problem, because there you have to really open the box. You have to go back to the system and see, was this at the level of the classification of the image? Was this at the level of the autonomous drone not flying precisely enough? Was it at the level of the human itself not understanding the feedback, etc.? And so this will require a different set of skills, I will say. So there are really two different aspects, and I see that one of them is quite well covered at some point in the document. I think it says that you want the instruction given by the machine to be interpretable or easy, user-friendly, etc. And I think that's well covered. The other part where you open the box and you try to understand what went wrong, I did not see this documented. And I think the only way to document that would be to actually store almost everything. But you imagine how difficult this is. This means that you will have to store, for instance, the entire videos that you have had for hours and hours. You'll have to maybe store not just the videos, but also if you have a classifier, and usually, you know, these algorithms, they have many different layers. So you'll have to store every single thing that took place in this algorithm. If the algorithm is deterministic, you don't need to store that. If the algorithm is stochastic, you need to store the decision that the algorithm took at every stochastic step, because you won't be able to reproduce them since it was stochastic.
Mm. It also makes me think of this very important point that Cynthia Rudin, a renowned expert on explainability, put it to me, that if all of that information that you're describing, Ord, is on the weapon system, and the weapon system is destroyed, as weapon systems often are in the course of an attack, then you have no way of conducting that audit. unless you were to pass that information back to the main command post. But as has often been pointed out, these autonomous weapons will not necessarily have a link that could pass that information back.
But since they're controlled by a human, they will obviously have a link. Now, will that bandwidth be sufficient to pass at least some of the input and some of the output? I don't know. You could imagine, I understand, and this is a fair concern. If it gets destroyed, you have a problem. It's a little bit like a plane crashing, and then you're left with the black box, and you have to reopen it. So you need to have something that at least will survive the crash. And you could try also to send, information, as planes do, to send back information to the base from time to time. And you could have in-house another copy. I mean, you should have a copy of your system such that then you can input whatever was input into that system and then sort of run in simulation what the output and the outcome of the system will have given you. But I do agree that it's fairly difficult, especially again, if you have something in motion. Flying over for a few seconds and you're recording only the inputs every 5 seconds, then you're missing out all what happened during these 4 seconds during which the drone flew down and entered into the wrong village. So that's the problem is the frequency at which you will be recording these on the base. That will matter compared to. In fact, you have to look at how fast the action happened in the field. And this also is a concern for human control over the platform. If things are moving very slowly, and you have a decision time which is measured in minutes, then you probably have the time to send enough information to the base and to record that. If decisions are taken within seconds or milliseconds, first, the human may not have the time to react if something goes wrong, and you may not have the time to record everything.
So I wanted to also bring up this other notion of a different form of understanding, which is the human's mental model, if you will. I often use the example that I don't know exactly how my oven works, but I know that if I put something in there for a certain amount of time, that it will give me a certain result. Now, that's partly a function of the fact that it's extremely predictable. It doesn't do anything that I wasn't anticipating. But in your experience, to what degree does that human mental model, the human's organic understanding, play in this kind of understandability equation that you're talking about?
It plays an enormous role. It's clear, but humans are flexible and they can be trained, like doctors who are trained to see things in images that we can't. If you've ever looked at an echography and they tell you, oh, here is the hand of your baby, and I cannot see the hand. So you can be trained at interpreting better the output of a system. There are things that you cannot be trained that well, typically to see things that are outside your senses. A lot of autonomous systems will use sonars, laser. These are sensors that we don't have as humans. So how to make the information conveyed by these sensors interpretable for humans is difficult. So there are a lot of people working on making this understandable to create an image that resembles a camera image or something that you will see with your eyes. Yeah, so there is this part to just the observation. Now, the motion of the system itself is extremely difficult for humans to interpret. If I give you an example of now, this time you have imagine, I don't know if people are developing this, but that you want now to have a machine that can really fire, that is like a gun, but that is like your arm. It is articulated and it will move around and then fire in different positions. If it's really like your arm, if it really moves with the same degrees of freedom as your arm, then probably you can predict, if it also has the same dynamics as your arm, you can predict that it's going to turn towards you and maybe fire onto you. But what happens with robotic systems is that often the way that the joints are attached if you want. I cannot do it. If I had a video of robots, I could show that to you. They really look different to a human. And so they move very differently. And so it makes it extremely difficult to predict that, it could be that in order to fire onto you, the rifle will actually go backwards and then come back. And then as it goes backward, you feel reassured that, oh no, it's going to fire somewhere else, but actually it's just turning around because it has to go around what we call a deadlock, and then it's going to come back to you right away. So there are these aspects that makes it fairly difficult to interpret by just looking at the behavior of the machine. And we as engineers are becoming aware of these aspects, and I'm trying to use different machine. That means we are trying to redesign also the body of the actual robot so that it looks like the body of a human, and that moves also with the same dynamics, because some of these robots, they will move at constant speed, which we never do as humans. We're at constant speed, and then they will accelerate suddenly and then constant speed again. And that's very unpredictable for a human as well. So there is also a lot of thought that is put on having a velocity profile, a speed profile that resembles something that we're used to. And if you don't have that, if the manufacturer does not provide this with the autonomous weapon, then you need to train people in the field to recognize it, to learn how this machine may behave.
Now, given all of these factors that you've described, I want to ask you the same question that I asked with regards to predictability, which is, to what extent is it possible for a complex autonomous system to be fully or perfectly understandable? Or is that is there always going to be some degree of mystery, if you will, in these machines?
In my view, there shouldn't be. And it's really up to us as designer to make sure that there isn't. So there shouldn't be, and I tend to move away from stochastic system for that reason, that at least it's deterministic, and that the way that you program the robots is fully understandable to you as the engineer, but it's going to be understandable to fairly skilled people. I think we have to be aware of that. It's not going to be given to anybody. This level of understandability, it's like for your oven. I mean, we're going to give you a set of instructions for you to understand that. If you want to know more about how to make an oven, you're going to go to Wikipedia and it's going to give you some explanation. It's going to be another level of understandability. But if your oven goes dead, you're going to need someone with the skill to fix it and to understand all the details. Okay? So I do believe that it's possible to make things understandable, but we need to force people to do so. And it's not the trend that I see in the field at the minute.
Well, given these shortcomings, if you will, that you've described in the field and these challenges that you've described in the technology itself, can you walk us through what you think are some of the measures that could make systems more predictable or understandable? And we hear about a lot of these different measures in the popular press, but I was also wondering if, when talking about these, you could describe if there are any limitations or trade-offs with these strategies to make systems more predictable or understandable.
Maybe if you can give an example of what measure you've seen being applied so far, I can respond to those, because there are many different ways in which one can.
Well, people talk, for example, about explainable AI, and a lot of faith has been put in the field of explainable AI as being a near future solution to the problems of understandability. Do you feel like that is merited, or do you feel like there are challenges or trade-offs with, for example, explainable AI that make the reality a little bit more complicated?
So as far as I know, people want to achieve, explainable AI, but haven't achieved that yet. So it's a valuable scientific goal. Were we to achieve it, then indeed it will make AI more trustable to some extent and more understandable. So yes, I think it's a valuable endeavor, but I don't think we're yet there by far and large, except for a certain number of systems. It depends what you want to do. Don't forget that AI, most of AI is really based on probability and statistics and construction. So we're back to this stochastic versus deterministic world. And as soon as you said that, like I explained at the very beginning, your level of interpretability and predictability would be bounded by, by the world of probability that exists in your model. And back to the example of that you need to have a set of images or a set of inputs to your system that are representative to whatever the system will see in the field. This is also something that people are working on to determine how comprehensive the representation of the world is. Am I really representing everything that I could ever see? We go back to this example of the riffle at the border. There you will have to really check that all the images that you've gathered over a period of 1 year are representative to what? And that's the big question. What is representative of what? And then you need to have a definition of what is it that, what is the context in which I'm working? What is the field I'm working on? It's super difficult to define that. So if you had such a definition, and we start with if you had such a definition, then yes, you could test the system. If you were able to say, look, I know that I'm never going to see images that have more than one target at a time in my image, but that's good news. I know that I'm always going to watch this at with daylight. That's good to know. Then you start putting a lot of boundaries, and then you can say, okay, the set of examples of images that I have meet these basic conditions. And so that means if I have 99.8% of recognition, then I'm almost sure, except for the 0.2%, that I will always detect correctly the target. But these boundary conditions, they have to be verbalized, they have to be defined, and then you have to check that the system matches that. It's a little bit like if I'm going to take an example of math, but when you have theorems, people say, oh, there is a beautiful theorem, but actually there is always a little trick in the theorem, is that there is the condition of applicability. Mm-hmm. A theorem always starts by, if you have that and that and that, then, and it's the same. If you could say that you have all these conditions, then you can predict that your system is going to behave this way. And it's the if that we're missing at this stage, and there is a lot of work going on trying to define this if. And then once you have that, then it's very easy to have a metric. But the problem is not so much to have a metric, is to know what to measure. And it's what to measure comes down to what are you trying to do? What are the boundary conditions that you're fixing for the system? I hope I'm not, that my speech is not too complex.
No, that's fantastic. And in fact, it dovetails perfectly with the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is that, if there are going to be regulations for autonomous systems that require a certain level of predictability or understandability, are there going to be challenges in defining what counts as appropriate predictability or understandability? Are there going to be challenges in measuring if a system has that required level of predictability and understandability? Do you see difficulties in, as you say, the definition side when it comes to actually implementing regulations for this stuff?
Yeah, I think it would be super, super challenging, because the big question would be, who will do that? In fact, who will test the system and in which condition? Ideally, you'd like to, to have an office dedicated to that. You like to have some form of certification. And I wonder how, so you could imagine to have that. You could imagine that we dedicate a part of the desert somewhere in one country, and then we test systematically all new vehicles, with weapons that can fire on things. And then we do have a set of targets flying around, and then we repeat this and we verify that they do not miss those targets. A little bit like you will verify that a soldier is, that the soldier is actually hitting the target 9 times out of 10 correctly. I mean, you could do setups like this. I could imagine it could be feasible. Now, I don't know if the countries will be willing to bring their weapons there to test it. It could be interesting. I would not completely rule out that it's unfeasible, but a lot of thinking needs to be put in this. And as much as I can see this possible for simple contexts, such as a vehicle moving in a desert, a vehicle moving in a forest, a vehicle moving in a village, a vehicle entering, streets of any part of the world, a drone flying in complex areas. There, I'm doubtful that it's possible to really do this type of certification. Yeah, I think it would be fairly difficult, depending on how complex, and this goes back to what you said before, the more complex the machine, but also the more complex the environment in which you want to use it, the more difficult it's going to be to certify that it will act the way that you want.
Well, a quick follow-up to that. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that a system is validated as having achieved a certain level of predictability or understandability. Over a long enough time scale, is it possible that that system's understandability or predictability will change or degrade, say, if the environment changes? Or do you feel like if that certification were possible, then it would last for a long time?
So if the system does not adapt, does not have a system inside that makes it change its own behavior, then it shouldn't change. What could degrade is if the environment, you started using it in this country and it worked well, and now all of a sudden you decide to make war with a completely different country, and you have forgotten that you need to retrain the machine to recognize, I don't know, the landscape of this other country, then indeed the performance may degrade. So but I don't think they will degrade as an effect of the system becoming old. There is no notion of that, unless you have an active adaptation system in it, which nowadays I don't think people will put that in the field unless I'm mistaken, but I think people usually will try to train it as much as possible before, or maybe on the field, but before actually using it, in the laboratory, then in the field, but before you actually using it, and then they will only use the finally trained system.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, Aude, to now turn it over to the audience to answer some of their questions. Some of our audience members have indeed already submitted questions. Let's start with some of those, and then I would encourage any other audience members who do have questions to submit them now so that we can make sure we have some time to get to them. Now, I'm going to start, Aude, with sort of two questions in one that have come from two of our audience members. One is that the audience member asks that the accuracy of a system relies heavily on the inputs and data sets provided, but aside from this, what are the other factors that contribute greatly to the robustness or the precision of a system? And then I'm going to tack on to that this other, perhaps more philosophical question that has come in from another audience member, which is to ask if you think that autonomous systems are more or less predictable than humans. Okay.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, they are related somehow and not. So maybe on the precision side of things, in principle, machines are much more precise than humans for certain things. Again, the example of, you know, the arm, the robot arm that will go and fire, it will certainly normally not tremble, not have any tremor, unless it's mounted onto a vehicle, and that's a different story. But aside from that, it shouldn't. So it will be extremely precise, and probably much more precise at, you know, at directing it at the exact angle that you wanted it, and to fire at the exact strength that you wanted it to fire. Yet, it may not be that precise to determine where to fire, and that will depend from this vision system or something else. For the robustness of the system, there are so many different levels about robustness, so I'll be very, very brief there. It's a machine, so it wears off like a human does, but not the same way. So a machine would be very precise, a little bit like your toaster for many days, many weeks, and then at some point it will toast less and less well. And you as human is a little different. You toast well for a few hours, and then you become tired, but the following day you toast again very well, and maybe you improve. So we are different in that sense. That's the oscillation of a machine is a little different to that of a robot, but that's that of a human. Are they? I think the question was, are they more predictable or less predictable? Are they predictable differently, or unpredictable differently? That's the usual example. That's these machines still hallucinate things in clouds. I mean, we do also when we look at clouds, but we know also how to not hallucinate when we look at clouds, because sadly we lack context. So machine, we talk about artificial intelligence, but frankly, there is not much intelligence in it. I want to be honest there, because to me, intelligence is the capacity of reasoning. It's the capacity of putting the context around, is the capacity of having some background knowledge and, you know, and making sense of what you're getting. And machines do not make sense of what they're getting. They're trained to say it's A, B, C, or I have to move that way, very precisely that way, or more or less that way. By the way, you can also train a robot to be more or less precise. You can give it also some slack by control, by definition. We do that often, especially when there are variations. If there is wind, for instance, you say to a drone, okay, you can fly, but it's okay if you drop down by 1 meter, it's still okay. You're within the tolerance of the system, so there can be some slack, but these are constrained given the system. The system is not reasoning, oh, there is more wind today, I should be more careful. Oh, there is less wind, I should be less careful. Oh, by the way, there are all these other factors, and no, there is very little. I mean, when there is a bit of reasoning, it's really that tiny. I don't know, you are 2 years old type of level of brain intelligence. So very, very distinct. The mistakes that a machine will make, the problem with this is that they will most of the time startle you. You will think, why is this machine not seeing the target? It's right in front of it. It's just because there have been some changes that you cannot perceive, because machines perceive things with different sense that you do. I said before, they use LiDARs, they use laser, and sometimes the LiDAR doesn't see anything because of the absorption coefficient. You have no clue what absorption coefficient means as a human, because your eyes don't have a problem with absorption coefficient, right? So there are different aspects to that, but you as a human will make tons of mistakes that a machine will never do. And typical one is that you lose attention after a while. And as you lose attention, you become less precise, both at recognizing what's provided to you and as well as controlling your rifle. And a machine does not have this problem. Yeah.
Well, that goes actually nicely to another question we got, which is this notion of whether you can sort of weigh the advantages of an autonomous weapon against the disadvantages in relation to the advantages and disadvantages of using a human. To me, it sounds a little bit, if you could just speak very briefly to this, like it may be hard to make that sort of one-to-one comparison between human expected performance in a particular context and the expected performance of an autonomous weapon system.
Yeah, it's actually a very difficult question because the question is what is your metric? The number of dead? I mean, it's going to become probabilistic. But both of them will kill. And what you're worried about is will they kill more often the wrong targets, and which one will do that more frequently, and would that be better if it's a little less frequent? I'm gonna say something that people may not like, but to me, just the fact that one person dies is a problem. So that the person be killed by a machine or a human is a problem to start with. And so starting to quantify this becomes a little bit tricky in terms of how many dead and how many not dead. So I don't know if there is an advantage. Certainly on the other side, being killed by a machine versus being killed by a human, okay, I think the question is well phrased in that context. Would you prefer be killed by a machine or by a human? I don't know what the answer is. I think we may want to ask people and poll people, what do you prefer, if anything? And they prefer probably not being killed at all, but if they had to choose, I don't know. So maybe that could be a metric interesting to look at.
Well, just to change slack a little bit, there's been this question that's been hanging here for a while about the current trending or exciting R&D areas. And just to put a slightly more specific spin on it, do you see any particular research areas that you feel are perhaps promising and particularly relevant for making autonomous systems more predictable or more understandable?
Definitely. So there is a huge area of research trying to be able to quantify, for instance, how much what we call the testing data set is similar to the training data set to start with, first of all, because sometimes they're almost identical. So you test on what you've trained. And there are also efforts be made on trying to encapsulate as much as possible what is the definition of an environment? What is the minimum criterion to encapsulate the key features that you need? So I'm becoming a little technical here, but people are trying to spell out really when you want to train a robot to be able to do this task, what are the minimum components that you need in the input to the robot for it to succeed at learning that? So there are a lot of, but these are still research area, a lot of research attempts that try to define properly a taxonomy of what is deemed to be a data set which will be sufficient to provide this capability in a robot. And so that is closely related to defining how much do I trust that this robot is capable of doing this particular task and always do it correctly with this given input. Because once you've been able to spell this out, then you can spell out what you need in terms of input and verify that this input is provided. And if not, then tell the robot not to do anything because it doesn't have the proper input. So yes, there is a huge amount of work now being done on trying to describe the data set, what we know about the data set, how well it represents, what the robot is going to do in the field.
And there again, it sounds like that, though, may require some kind of standardization, some kind of body that would be able to do this kind of stress testing, these evaluations. Yeah.
Yes, and benchmarking also, and having competitions to force people to always benchmark and compare. There is also a huge momentum now to force people when they develop new codes to declare the entire code and data sets and to have this peer reviewed, and so that we can compare that and to systematically compare. So it's on the move, but it's getting there slowly.
So there's another interesting question that came in from one of our audience members. That refers to the fact that in the context of the group of government experts on laws, often the debate focuses around what are known as the critical functions of an autonomous weapon. So, selecting and engaging targets. But this audience member asks if there are also questions of predictability and understandability that are relevant to other functions of the system. Now, I'm going to say, for example, navigation or propulsion or motion and communication, and whether we should take those functions into account precisely because they may have similar challenges of understandability or predictability?
I mean, the short answer is yes. It's clear. I mean, you have to look at all these aspects, especially the communication one. I mean, if there is any slight doubt that the way that the machine is communicating with the person who has to decide whether to press on a button or not, then this needs to be fully disclosed and solved. That's obvious. I don't know in which context this could happen, though, because it seems that these communication channels are fairly well described. So I wouldn't have an example on top of my head just now. But if this could happen, I mean, one should really look at the entire process, not just the one at the decision. I mean, all what makes, if you, that's what I said before, is if you press a button and you say, go to this target, then you really need to be able to say that it's going there. And if it's not, can you intervene in between? What, and at which level can you intervene, or how precisely can you also provide to the machine some information as to the tolerance? Yes, you have to fly there, but what is the acceptable tolerance? Because it's not going to be perfectly precise sometimes. I'm thinking already here of vehicles moving around, driving drones. Maybe it's a little more predictable, but driving vehicles, come on, it could be slowed down. It could be sliding slightly. What is the tolerance that you have in terms of the time it will take before it reaches the target? That also matters. And how precisely it's going to fire at the target once you have decided to fire.
It just makes me think that one of the points that we've always been big fans of here at UNIDEER is this notion of thinking of autonomous weapons in a systems of systems approach. So not just to think about them in terms of that one component that is the quote unquote artificial intelligence, but to really think about these systems in terms of the interaction between all of the different components of the system, and to think about the ways that may affect the performance of these systems. So we are running a little short on time. I'm just going to read out the last two questions that came in. I'll put a hard cap on it there, and then I'm going to abuse my moderator's privilege and tack onto that one last question for you. So one question that comes in asks not to deny the worries related to possible unpredictability in autonomous systems, but in practice, these systems rely on a hybrid architecture that combines both deterministic model-based mechanisms and stochastic or probabilistic database mechanisms. And so in raising this question of these hybrid systems, which I'm sure you're very well familiar with, I would suggest that the question's asking, how does that change what we're talking about here? Another question is on the notion of intelligence that you alluded to just earlier, how you would define non-human intelligence in the AI and ML community. And if real intelligence is as hard to achieve as you suggest, what is the next best thing? So I'm throwing these two questions at you, and then I'm just going to abuse my moderator's privilege with one third question to tie us up a little bit. If you could suggest any particular actions by the policy community to address some of the issues that we've been talking about today, what would those proposals be, and why?
Okay, thank you, Arthur. I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to repeat your last question because I was trying to read the second question. I couldn't completely follow it, but let me take each of them one at a time. So on the deterministic, on the hybrid system, the person who asked this question is right. I mean, definitely it's hybrid in many different ways. By the way, you may have more than just one probabilistic, one deterministic. I mean, sometimes you could even switch across those different systems. The major issue, I don't think it changes much of what we're discussing, because if the input you're getting, you as a human, that's well, I mean, there are two aspects, but basically, if you combine deterministic and probabilistic, then it becomes probabilistic. Probabilistic will win over deterministic. Okay, that's the way that it works. If, on the other hand, they're separated, I get a probabilistic system. That's my vision input. It's probabilistic. Okay, give me some probability, and then I press on a button, and I have a deterministic system to some extent that flies the drone to the place. Then what matters is that the human in charge understand that one is deterministic, you can trust, and it only acts upon the command that you've given, and there is some tolerance and some noise outside. Okay, but it's deterministic in some functioning. And the other one, you're not too sure because it gives you a probability. So you may want to wait, and ask the system 3 times what it thinks about these 3 different consecutive images before you take a decision based on what the system is returning to you. So the difference is really on the level with which, you're interacting with the probabilistic system or you're interacting with the deterministic one. And that's where there is maybe a slight difference, and people need to understand that because they may not be aware of this. The second question was about human intelligence. So
essentially what it boils down to is, as you mentioned, human intelligence is very hard to achieve in machines. Our audience member asks, what is the next best thing? I mean, if we're not going to get a system to have an adult's level of intelligence, what should we be aiming for?
It's a support. I mean, AI is there to support, to augment your intelligence if you want to augment it in a way that where we're not very good. To me, human intelligence is the smartness of human is to not store everything, to retain only what matters, which is what's going to happen from this meeting. You will retain only a few things that we've discussed, and you usually retain what matters really. I mean, and you discard a lot of information, but by discarding, you also lose important information, and you have this problem of attention, etc. The AI system is a fantastic memory. To me, most of those systems are really an incredible data storage machine, and most importantly, not just data storage, but data retrieval. That's the most difficult part, because you can have a huge data storage, like I have a huge library of books and dictionary, but if you ask me for something, I'm going to go like, oh yeah, it's in this book, and it will take me a while to find it in the chapter. And this system, they can find it super rapidly. So they augment, if you want, your knowledge. And I see them more as a knowledge-based system, as we used to call them. They provide a huge amount of knowledge, and you can rely on this knowledge, and they augment the amount that you can have in your head. But the smartness, which is about decision, reasoning, understanding, there we're very far, and this is still human-like. So the best thing we can have now is a good compromise, is to have humans work hand in hand with the machine, but not think that the machine is going to replace you, unless it's for tasks that are incredibly repetitive and predictable. And in this case, yes, the machine will be able to replace you very well, because of course, well, you're not very good at those things. But when it comes to very challenging tasks, such as I can imagine, deciding when to fire a weapon and things like that, there it must be a consensus between the two.
So with that, let's use these last couple of minutes to get to that last question that I posed to you, about what ideas or suggestions or recommendations you would propose to the policy community with relation to these issues in the context of autonomous weapons.
I mean, it's difficult. I think we should be careful not to go ahead too fast with allowing autonomous weapons to be used, because we're still far from being able to fully assess and understand these new systems. So if we can, we should slow down a little, and to be able to achieve what we've just discussed today, which is how can we assess the boundaries of our system, when it's going to fail and when not, how to use it, how to train it, how to compare them, to what degree can the human still be in control, and to do that in a more systematic manner. I don't think we're Yet there, even scientifically speaking, we don't have a good solution to interpret and understand everything that is going on in some of these artificial intelligence software. So if you request this to happen, maybe it's a way to slow down, but at the same time, if you create guidelines about that and you say, okay, we say it's okay to use this system, but they have to be interpretable and understandable, and there is no consensus yet, scientifically speaking, as to how to make a system how to evaluate that a system is predictable and understandable, then the danger is that somebody will come up with some simple way of assessing that, and it will become the norm, and it will be simplistic, and it will be not representative of what the real challenge is. So my advice would be slow down.
If there's one thing for people to remember from this session, perhaps that it could be a valuable one. And also, I hope our audience has taken away this notion that there are complexities here. We're very lucky that there are wonderful minds like Ord working on these exact issues. But the notion really being that when we talk about predictability and understandability, there is quite a lot of depth there. That's not to say these are intractable problems, but there is depth and complexity and nuance that is important. And I think that is an excellent note for us to end on, if that sounds good to you, Ord.